June 23, 1942. Royal Air Force spotters at Pembrey Airfield in South Wales watched through binoculars as a sleek German fighter descended through the clouds and lined up for landing. Alert sirens should have been screaming. Anti-aircraft guns should have been tracking the enemy aircraft. But something about the pilot's approach seemed wrong. The Focke-Wulf 190 touched down smoothly on the grass runway and rolled to a stop near the control tower. The engine shut down. The canopy slid back, and Oberleutnant Armin Faber of Jagdgeschwader 2 climbed out of his cockpit, pulled off his leather helmet, and looked around at the unfamiliar buildings. Then his blood ran cold. The aircraft on the flight line weren't Messerschmitts. They were Spitfires. The uniforms running toward him weren't Luftwaffe gray. They were Royal Air Force blue. And the realization that hit Faber in that moment was the same one simultaneously striking British intelligence officers across southern England. Germany's most lethal fighter, the aircraft that had been slaughtering Allied pilots for months, the mysterious new weapon that seemed invincible in combat, had just been delivered intact to Britain by a pilot who had gotten disoriented and thought he was landing in France. The intelligence windfall was staggering, but what American test pilots would discover when they finally got their hands on this aircraft would change how every Allied fighter engaged German aircraft for the rest of the war. For 8 months, the Focke-Wulf 190 had been a nightmare haunting Allied pilots across the Channel. It had first appeared in combat over France in September 1941, and from its very first engagement, pilots knew they were facing something extraordinary. Royal Air Force Squadron Leader J.E. Johnson, who would become Britain's top-scoring ace, encountered the FW-190 in early 1942 and barely survived. It was faster than our Spitfire Mark V's in level flight and in the dive, he would write. It could outroll us. Its firepower was devastating. For the first time in the war, our fighters were comprehensively outclassed. The statistics backed up the terror. In the first 6 months of 1942, RAF fighter losses over France climbed dramatically. Experienced pilots who had survived the Battle of Britain were being shot down by an aircraft they couldn't match. The FW-190 could dive away from pursuing Spitfires, outroll them in turning combat, and destroy them with cannons that fired 20mm explosive shells. American pilots arriving in Britain with their P-47 Thunderbolts heard the warnings immediately. Don't engage the 190 in turning combat. Don't try to outroll it. Don't get into a dive competition. The list of what not to do was long. The list of what would work was terrifyingly short. Intelligence desperately needed answers. What made this aircraft so effective? What were its limitations? How could Allied fighters counter it? But getting those answers required examining an actual FW-190, and every example shot down over Britain had been too damaged to reveal its secrets. Then Armin Faber made his catastrophic mistake. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the FW-190. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard this story before. And if you appreciate this level of historical detail, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Oberleutnant Armin Faber was not a novice pilot. At 21 years old, he had already scored multiple victories and was considered a skilled member of Jagdgeschwader 2, the elite Richthofen fighter wing. On June 23, 1942, he was flying as part of a fighter sweep over the English Channel, providing top cover for German bombers attacking coastal targets. The mission had gone smoothly until the return flight. Somewhere over the Channel, During aggressive maneuvering while engaging British fighters, Faber became disoriented. Cloud cover obscured the coastline. The sun's position gave him false directional cues. And when he broke through the clouds and saw green countryside with an airfield below, his mind made a simple but catastrophic assumption. He thought he was over France looking at a Luftwaffe base. He was actually over Wales looking at RAF Pembrey. The mistake seems impossible in hindsight, but combat disorientation was more common than militaries admitted. Pilots flying at high speeds through clouds, pulling high-G maneuvers that affected blood flow to the brain, sometimes lost their sense of direction. Faber had done a 180-degree turn during the dogfight and simply didn't realize it. When he landed and saw the Spitfires, Faber attempted to restart his engine and take off again, but RAF personnel were already surrounding the aircraft. Within minutes, he was in custody, and British intelligence officers were examining the pristine Focke-Wulf 190A3 sitting on their runway. The immediate reaction at RAF headquarters bordered on euphoria. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas, commanding RAF Fighter Command, immediately ordered the aircraft transported to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough for testing. Every aspect of the machine was to be documented, measured, and analyzed. Within 48 hours, the FW-190 was at Farnborough being inspected by Britain's top aviation engineers. What they found explained everything Allied pilots had been experiencing in combat. The aircraft was a masterpiece of practical engineering. While the Spitfire represented elegant aerodynamic design, the FW-190 embodied brutal functionality. Its BMW 801 radial engine produced 1,700 horsepower, compared to the Spitfire Mark V's 1,470. But raw power wasn't the whole story. The FW-190's most devastating advantage was its roll rate. The aircraft could snap from one bank to the other faster than any Allied fighter. This seemingly minor characteristic was actually revolutionary in combat. When a Spitfire tried to follow an FW-190 through rolling maneuvers, the British fighter couldn't keep up. The German pilot could reverse direction, gain angles, and line up shots before the Allied pilot could react. British test pilot Captain Eric Brown flew the captured FW-190 extensively and immediately understood why Allied pilots were dying. The ailerons were light and responsive at all speeds, he reported. You could throw this aircraft around the sky with almost no effort. The Spitfire required muscle and finesse. The FW-190 responded to thought. The firepower advantage was equally stunning. The FW-190A3 carried four 20mm MG 151 cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns. A 2-second burst delivered more explosive power than a Spitfire Mark V could generate in 10 seconds of firing. And the weapons were mounted in the wings close to the fuselage, creating a tight concentration pattern that was devastating at combat ranges. The dive performance explained how FW-19s consistently escaped pursuing Spitfires. The German fighter's heavier weight and cleaner aerodynamics meant it could outdive anything the RAF flew. Pilots who tried to follow an FW-190 into a steep dive watched helplessly as the German aircraft pulled away. But the testing also revealed weaknesses. And this is where the intelligence value became strategic gold for Allied forces. The FW-190's radial engine, while powerful, created cooling problems at high altitudes. Above 20,000 feet, the aircraft's performance fell off dramatically. The engine struggled in the thin air, and pilots reported loss of power and overheating issues. Meanwhile, the Spitfire's Merlin engine, designed for high-altitude operation, actually performed better as altitude increased. The heavy weight that made the FW-190 a superior dive bomber also made it less maneuverable in sustained turning combat. The aircraft could outroll a Spitfire, but it couldn't outturn one in a prolonged engagement. If an Allied pilot could force an FW-190 into a sustained horizontal turn fight, the advantage shifted. Most critically, American engineers discovered that the FW-190's controls became extremely heavy at high speeds. In a dive exceeding 400 miles per hour, the pilot needed significant strength to pull out. This created a vulnerable moment. If an Allied fighter could pursue an FW-190 through the initial dive and catch it during the pullout, when the German pilot was fighting his own controls, attacks became feasible. British intelligence immediately began distributing tactical bulletins to RAF squadrons, but they also did something that would prove crucial for the air war's outcome. They invited American test pilots to Farnborough to fly the captured FW-190. In August 1942, U.S. Army Air Force pilots arrived at Farnborough to examine Germany's secret weapon. These pilots would return to American training bases with knowledge that would save hundreds of American lives. Major Cass Hove, one of the first American pilots to fly the captured FW-190, filed a detailed report that was distributed to every fighter group preparing to deploy to Europe. His assessment was blunt and tactical. The FW-190 will beat any Allied fighter below 20,000 feet if the German pilot knows what he's doing, Hull wrote. Our advantage is altitude. Above 25,000 feet, our P-47s and later model Spitfires have the edge. Force them high, and we win. Let them dictate low-altitude combat, and we die. This single piece of intelligence fundamentally changed American fighter tactics in Europe. When P-47 Thunderbolt units began operations in 1943, their doctrine emphasized high-altitude combat. Bomber escorts flew at maximum altitude. Fighter sweeps operated above 25,000 feet, whenever possible. When German fighters attempted to engage, American pilots would climb, forcing the FW-190s to follow into the thin air where their engines struggled. The captured FW-190 also influenced American aircraft development. Engineers at Wright Field studied the roll rate advantage and began modifying P-47 and P-51 ailerons to improve responsiveness. The FW-190's gun placement informed American thinking about weapons concentration. Even the cockpit layout, which German designers had optimized for combat efficiency, influenced American fighter design. But perhaps the most important lesson came from understanding that the FW-190 wasn't invincible. It was an excellent aircraft with specific advantages and exploitable weaknesses. Allied pilots who had been psychologically intimidated by the 190's reputation now had concrete information about how to fight it and win. By late 1943, the tactical situation had shifted dramatically. American P-47s and P-51s were engaging FW-190 at high altitude where Allied fighters held the advantage. RAF Spitfire. Mark 9s, with upgraded Merlin engines, could match the FW-190's performance across most altitude ranges, and pilots on both sides understood they were flying different aircraft optimized for different conditions. The kill ratios began shifting in Allied favor. FW-190 losses climbed as American and British pilots exploited the intelligence gained from Faber's captured aircraft. German pilots noticed that Allied fighters were no longer making the tactical mistakes that had given the FW-190 its early dominance. Oberleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, a high-scoring FW-190 ace, commented in late 1943 that American pilots had clearly studied the aircraft. They know not to follow us into rolling scissors. They force us high where our engines labor. They've learned, he wrote in his combat journal. The captured FW-190 remained at Farnborough throughout the war, serving as a reference aircraft for evaluating new German variants as they appeared. When the FW-190D9 Dora, with its inline engine, appeared in late 1944, Allied intelligence immediately compared it to Faber's captured aircraft, understanding how German designers had addressed the original's high-altitude limitations. After the war, aviation historians calculated the impact of Faber's mistake. The intelligence gained from examining the intact FW-190 was shared with thousands of Allied pilots through tactical bulletins, training films, and direct demonstration flights. The knowledge influenced aircraft development, tactical doctrine, and operational planning across multiple air forces. Captain Eric Brown, who flew more captured enemy aircraft than any Allied pilot, would later write, "Faber's navigation error gave us the Rosetta Stone for understanding German fighter design." Every tactical advantage the FW-190 possessed was documented, and every weakness was exploited. That single aircraft probably saved more Allied lives than any intelligence coup of the war. The irony was not lost on German intelligence when they learned what had happened. One Luftwaffe officer commented, "We spent months trying to capture a Spitfire Mark 9 intact so we could study its improvements. The British didn't have to try. We delivered our best fighter directly to them." Armin Faber spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Canada. He survived the war and returned to Germany, where he lived until 1976. Luftwaffe records suggest he was initially blamed for the loss of the aircraft, but later assessments acknowledged that combat disorientation could happen to any pilot. The real question was why German intelligence had assumed the British would never get their hands on an intact FW-190. The story of Faber's captured fighter teaches a crucial lesson about the nature of technological advantage in warfare. Germany's Focke-Wulf 190 represented a quantum leap in fighter design when it appeared in 1941. For nearly a year, it dominated Allied aircraft through superior performance and innovative engineering. But that advantage evaporated the moment Allied engineers could examine the actual machine. No aircraft is invincible. Every design involves compromises and trade-offs. The FW-190's low-altitude dominance came at the cost of high-altitude performance. Its excellent roll rate came with heavy, high-speed controls. Its powerful armament added weight that reduced maneuverability. Once Allied pilots understood these trade-offs, they could exploit them. Today, the FW-190 is remembered as one of World War II's great fighter designs. Aviation museums display surviving examples as masterpieces of German engineering. But the aircraft's reputation is inseparable from the intelligence coup that revealed its secrets. In the complex calculus of wartime advantage, one pilot's momentary disorientation over the English Channel turned Germany's secret weapon into an open book. The FW-190 that Armin Faber accidentally delivered to Britain became the aircraft that taught the Allies how to win. The lesson echoes through military history. Superior technology matters. Superior intelligence matters more. And sometimes the greatest victories come not from devastating attacks, but from simple mistakes that give your enemy exactly what they've been desperately seeking. The Focke-Wulf 190 could have remained a mystery, an invincible opponent that continued slaughtering Allied pilots through psychological advantage as much as technical superiority. Instead, it became a teaching tool that every Allied pilot studied, learned from, and ultimately defeated. One navigation error, one landed aircraft, one intelligence windfall that changed the air war over Europe. That's how America got Germany's secret fighter, and that's how a single mistake shifted the balance of power in the skies.